Okay. Hi, Afia. Am I audible? Hello. Hello, am I audible? And is my screen visible? Hello. Yeah. So, Afia, only you have seemed to join today, at least till now. So, should we start the session? Okay. So I am Geetika. I am a PhD at IIC Bangalore in the Center for Ecological Sciences, and this is the uh, tutorial session for the sixth week of the course Wildlife Ecology. And in this week, let's just keep this a very interactive session since only like a few of you are here. So please respond to the questions. And if you have any issues, any doubts in the quizzes that have been given before or in today's session, you can please ask me at any point. Okay. So in this week, what we learned was about communities. So this week was mostly about the the nature of the community and its parameters, the various changes that occur in a community and ecological succession, and community organization, or how does a community get organized. Okay, so what is a community? We have discussed this many times now in this course. So, can you guys tell me what is a community? Or how do you define a community? You can either type it out in the chat box or just unmute yourself and give the answer. Yes, Afia. Okay, so community is an association of organisms with properly in a properly structured manner. Okay, you can you please elaborate association of organisms as in even a population is an association of organisms, an assemblage of population of living organisms in a habitat. Okay. You're also correct, Rajeshri. I think you guys are missing out on a very important part of the definition that these are populations belonging to different species. Because if you just say organisms or if you just say populations, that is not very clear that you're trying to mention that these belong to different species. So, yes, okay. So, a community is an association of populations of living organisms which belong to different species and they share the same geographical area and they're found at the same time in that area. And community ecology, which is also called synecology, that is the study of the interactions between these various species in the communities. And it is carried out in many different forms. It can be done over the spatial scales, temporal scales, and we look at the distribution of different species, the number of species that are present in a community, or the abundance of these different species. And we also look at the demography, the structure of how these species are structurally organized in that area, and the interactions between these populations. Okay, so next is an ecotone. So, what is an ecotone? Or what do we mean by an ecotone? It is a very simple, uh, straightforward definition. Do you guys know what is an ecotone? The transition area between two communities. Correct. Very nice. So the transition area or the border between two adjacent communities is called an ecotone. It is divided into two basic categories. It can be a sharp ecotone or it can be a diffuse ecotone, depending on how well it demarcates one community from the other community. So here are some images, and you can tell me like which two communities is this particular ecotone separating. Yes, this is a forest and grass ecotone. And what does this image show? Which you can actually see three communities in this image, but what are the two major communities that the ecotone is separating? Marine and grassland, yes. And the next one, this is the Last image. So this ecotone separates which two communities? Shrubs and grasses. Correct. Thank you so much. And so, in which of these ecosystems would you say is a sharp ecotone, and in which others, or which other would you say that it is a diffused ecotone? Okay, so by looking at these images, which of these do you think are very clearly demarcated from each other, and which of them are not? Anyone? One and two. Okay, yes. So this one is the first image, which shows the forest and the grassland. It is very clearly demarcated. It seems like it is sort of an anthropogenic structure, as in uh, some humans might have made this, because this is a very clear demarcation which is not naturally found mostly. So there is grasses on this side, and very clearly just the forests or the big trees come up. In the second image, if you consider the shrubs and the marine ecosystem, they are clearly demarcated. But if you consider the forest and the marine ecosystem, there is a diffused ecotone of the shrubs in between, because they sort of cover the area between one and the other. And the third one, which is the shrubs and the grasslands, this I would say is diffused, because here also, on the right there are grasses and on the left there are shrubs, but even in some places on the right you can find some shrubs creeping up. So this would be a diffused ecotone. Okay. So moving on, so what are the various attributes of a community, or how would you, or what would you say is common among different communities, or like the common features of a community, for example? So, what are the various attributes that we find in a community, or yeah, or the features of communities that are common between them? Very nice. Co-occurrences of species, and so co-occurrence of species is basically when one species is found, you're also bound to find the other one mostly in that same as a part of one community. Reoccurrence of community species, correct. Reoccurrence is that if you sample different communities and you find, say, species A, you will also find species B with the associated species with that particular species A. Because so these both of these species are said to reoccur between different communities. And the last one would be self-regulation. Yes. Homeostasis or self-regulation, which means that a community is so structured or so made that it can basically regulate itself. If there is a minor fluctuation, or even if there is a major fluctuation, if there's a change, the community can come back to its initial stage, or it can maintain homeostasis. So, co-occurrence of species, this you would say that it mostly occurs because those species would either be dependent on each other in some way. For example, say if you have a tree species, a fruiting tree or a flowering tree, and then you have, say, sunbirds or other sort of birds close to that species tree. Say there are parakeets that are feeding on its fruits, or there are some pollinator species. Then these are bound to co-occur, because the tree species is providing the pollinators, the parakeets, the sunbirds with a resource, and in turn the pollinators and the parakeets, they're providing them with services like seed dispersal or with pollination services, these things. So this is why they will co-occur. and they will reoccur also because of similar reasons, that if there is supposed to be species A, or say the plant, then again the species or the fruit eating birds or the pollinators, insects, they will also follow this species because they get resources and services in exchange. Okay, so moving on, what are the characteristics of a community? Or these would be certain things that are specific to a particular community. And when you move on from community to community, all of them will have these specific characteristics, but they will be different for each community. So, what are the characteristics of a community? Species diversity, very nice. And so, species diversity basically would mean what is the number of species present in the area, or how many different species are present in that particular ecosystem. And then there is growth, form, and structure. Yes, how are those species, if you're talking about, say, plants, how are the species structured? Is there a canopy, a mid canopy, an understory, all these different layers? How are they stratified and how are they structured? Dominance, yes, how which species are present in larger numbers that dominate that particular area or that habitat, and which species are present in lower numbers. Relative abundance, yes, how are the species, what is the abundance of different species as compared to each other? Okay, yes, so the you have covered all the characteristics that you find in a community. What is the species diversity? So you will see that between communities the species diversity might change. So if, say, a community A may have 10 species, but a community B might have 20 species, if it can support all these different species. Then growth from and stratification, as it was mentioned, what are the different layers at which, or the different strata at which organisms are present? Then there is dominance, which species is more abundant or which is more dominant, has a greater role in that particular habitat. Relative abundance of species, how many individuals of, or how many organisms are present per species in that ecosystem or in that habitat. And what is the trophic structure, or which would mean that which species are feeding on which other species. So these are some characteristics of a community. And moving on, let's discuss how will you describe a community. When somebody asks you to go out in the field and look at a particular habitat, look at the community that is found there, and asks you to describe the community, how will you describe it? So some of these have been covered in the characteristics, because obviously if you're going to describe a community, you're going to note down the various characteristics of that particular community in that area. So yes, you will go and you will find out the what is the number of species, or what are the different species that that particular community is composed of. And again, related to the number of species would also be the abundance of these species, or what is the number of individuals per species that you found in that area. So number one would be the species richness of the community. Number two would be the species abundance. This you can find out either using the number of individuals of that particular species, which would be a direct measure. You can look at the biomass of that particular species, or if you are taking drone images or satellite images, then you can see what is the area covered by that particular species, and you can use it as a measure for the species abundance. And then the third thing you look at is the species dominance, which would be what is the rank of that species based on its abundance in that habitat. So the species that is the most abundance would have the first rank, and then followed by species which are lower in abundance in that area. Again, for this abundance, you can measure it by the number of individuals or by the area that is covered by them. So, what do you think makes the species dominant? Or why would you say that this species is dominant in this particular habitat or in this particular community? So, what makes a species dominant? Anyone? We have sort of discussed this just in the previous slide. Fitness. No, in this sense of the species being dominant in the community, fitness is not one of the things that matter. Here, yes, it is either the abundance of the species, how abundant in the is that species in that particular community. If it is in higher numbers, then of course it is going to dominate that particular community. And the other thing would be its role in the community. How does it affect the structure of the community? So, the species that are highly successful in a particular community, and because of them, the other species or the associated species are getting affected, and their growth is getting affected because of this particular species. So that is called a dominant species. And two major things that can make a species dominant is that it can either be highly abundant in that area, or it can be the keystone species. Keystone species would mean that a species that is lower in its numbers, but its impact is huge on that particular ecosystem. So we have discussed a number of examples of keystone species in the previous tutorials and in the previous lectures. For example, say you have a tiger species in an area, and you have some cheetahs and hyenas in that area. So, if there is no tiger, if there is no apex predator, the cheetahs are going to increase in number because they don't have any predators. And these and the hyenas are going to get active in that area because the tiger is not there to scare them away. So the hyenas are going to get active, cheetahs are going to increase in number, and because of increased cheetahs, there's going to be increased grazing, and so the resource is going to come down. So in this situation, the tiger is a keystone species because if you reintroduce the tiger in that area, the hyena predation is going to go under check again. The cheetahs are going to get reduced in number, and the grasses are also going to flourish. So it is going to regulate the entire community. So let's talk about these three different measures: the relative density of a particular species, the relative frequency, and the relative dominance. So, what are the formulae, or how do you define the relative density of a particular species in a community? So, as the term suggests, relative density, it's basically just the ratio of the number of individuals of that particular species divided by the total number of individuals present in that community. And you multiply this by 100 to get a percentage. So, this would be the relative density of that particular species. Frequency, in the same sense, would be how frequently do you find that species in that community. So here it's the ratio of the frequency of that particular species divided by the sum of frequency values of all the different species multiplied by 100 again. So here you can, one way of measuring it is if you have a sampling unit, if you have a quadrat, or if you have transect samplings, how frequently, or how frequently do you spot that species in those quadrats or on those transects? And that you divide by the frequency values for all species, and then you multiply it by 100 to get the relative frequency. And the relative dominance basically is what is the basal area covered by that species divided by the total basal area of the community and multiplied by 100 again. So these are three measures that you talk about when you're describing a species. And moving on, we have the association between different species. How are these species associated? So, say you have a species X here and you have a species Y, and if the species X is present and the species Y is present, this would be called a co occurrence, and this would be a positive interaction between, it would mean that these two species are positively associated with each other. And this type of association is termed as type A. If species Y is absent, and consequently species X is also absent, so if you don't find Y, you don't find X either, it again means that they both are positively associated with each other, and if one is present, only then the other will also be found. But the other two values of the matrix, if the species Y is present and X is absent, that would mean that the species Y is found only if the species X is not found in that area. And consequently, this here type C would mean that X is found only if the Y species Y is not found. So this would be something like a negative association between these two species. It could be either they are competitors, they both occupy the similar niches, and that is why they cannot co-occur in the same community, or it could be that they are predators and prey and that is why they're avoiding each other, and if one is found the other is not found in that area. Okay, so there are different community theories that have been put forth. So can you guys tell me what are the different community theories that have been put forth by people over time? So some of these were mentioned in the lectures. So what are the major community theories that are out there? Anyone? Afia, Rajeshri? Organismal theory, neutral theory, and individualistic theory. Very nice. So the organismal theory, or the Clements organismic theory, Hubble's neutral theory, Hubble put forth the neutral theory, and the Gleason's continuum or the individualistic theory. So can you tell me what is the organismic theory all about? Or like, can you tell me in a few words what does it say? Or according to this theory, what is a community? Community is a superorganism. Yes, so according to the Clemens organismic theory, a community is basically a superorganism which is composed of different species. So, just like an organism which is composed of various organ systems and organs, and all of them come together to form the organism, similarly, all these species, these are different organisms which come together to form the community, which he terms as the superorganism. And this superorganism has emergent properties. Like these species present differently would not have those properties, but when they're put together to form the community, it has these certain properties. So the emergent property means that the whole is more than the sum of its parts, right? So according to Clemens' theory, the community is a superorganism which with some emergent properties. So what is the Hubble's neutral theory? What does Hubble have to say about a community? Equivalent when changes by random, yes. So Hubble's neutral theory just says that different species, they're functionally equivalent, and their abundance, it changes by the random births and deaths of species. So basically he does not say how these species are interacting with each other. He just says that these species are functionally equivalent. So all the species, so according to him, all the insectivores would be functionally equivalent to each other. The different species that form these insectivorous guild, they are not different from each other. They are functionally equivalent. So if one of them gets killed off, another one can replace it anyway. So that is why he says that all these species are functionally equivalent, and their abundance will only change if some of them randomly die or others are randomly found in that area. And the Gleason's individualistic or the continuum theory, this states that communities, they are not very tightly structured. They are just an outcome of a coincidence. Sorry. So because of a chance dispersal, these particular species, they ended up in this particular area, and now they're living here in the same geographic area in the same time, and that is why they are forming the community there. And something that has happened is there was dispersal. So there are these three different things that he's talking about. There is dispersal into that area, there is environmental sorting, and there is species interactions. So these three, they structure the community. So we'll come to this later, how these three processes, they structure the community. But according to Gleason, the communities are not very tightly structured, but they are just an outcome of a coincidence. So moving on, so this is what I meant by how a community is formed, and these are the three different filters that mostly scientists talk about. So from the species pool, which would mean all the species that can be present in that area, first filter would apply is the dispersal filter. That is only a few species, these species, they get dispersed into this particular area. Others cannot reach this area. So this is the first filter. Then the second filter is the abiotic filter. What are the different conditions, the temperature conditions, the water conditions in that area that affect the precipitation, all these abiotic factors that affect the presence of the particular species and their requirements. So you can see here, after the abiotic so after the dispersal filter, sorry, first of all, after the dispersal filter, out of the species pool, the circle and the rhombus, these, or the parallelogram, both of these species, these got kicked out. Only these particular species could be found in this area. And after the abiotic filter, or after getting filtered by the environmental conditions, only we're left with these four species. And the biotic filter is basically the interactions among these species. Some of them can be competitors and they can face competitive exclusion and so on. So out of these four, only three of these species could form the final community. So as you can again see, here is an illustration. So the species pool is huge, but only some of these insects or some of these arthropods get forwarded from the dispersal filter, which, after reaching here, they will be acted upon by the environment. They will face all these different conditions, and from the environmental filter only some of them will pass through. And after the interactions, the exclusion of the competitors, or the predation of the prey and everything, only these six form the final community in that area. So this is one of the ways in which the community is structured, which is mentioned by Gleason. So, okay, how do you define a guild? This is one of the categories in which the species are put together. So, what do we mean by a guild? Group of species use the same resource similar way. Exactly. Yes, you're correct, Rajeshri. So, basically, all the species that utilize the same resource in the same way, they are termed as a guild. And in this image, you can see that we have these different resource categories. We have fish, we have birds, mammals, we have invertebrates, crabs, we have soil invertebrates, we have planktons, and we have these fruits, seeds, leaves, or these plant parts. So out of these resources, we call the trophic guild. So all the birds that feed on fish, we put them in the guild called piscivores. All the birds that feed on aquatic insects, they're called aquatic insectivores. Similarly, the ones that feed on the aquatic plants, they will be called plant consumers or the aquatic plant consumers. And similarly, for the terrestrial ones, we have these different guilds. These will be called and further, the ones that feed on fruits, they will be called frugivores. Ones that are specialized on nectar, they will be called nectarivores. Like that, different species are or categorized into different guilds based on which resources they are utilizing. Moving on to what is a niche, or how do you define a niche of a particular species? So, niche is a term that you come across very often in ecology. So, you should, and there are many different definitions of niche that have been put forward, but I guess people should, or at least when you are using a particular definition, you should just look at the context and stick to the definition that you're using for the niche. So, how do you define a niche? What is a niche? Yes, it's the role of organism in the ecosystem. So a lot of people also call the niche as the profession of the organisms, basically where they are found and what they are doing. So it's a multidimensional description of an organism's resource needs, habitat requirements, environment tolerances. So this was one definition of a niche. In basically in this you build different axes. Along these axes you could have, say, temperature, the level of precipitation, the size of the organism that they prey on, say the size of the seed that they consume, and then you can have these habitat requirements of whether they are found in the canopy or in the mid-story, understory, all these things. And in this multi-dimension, your organism will fall in a certain cluster of points that say it is found in only the temperature ranges of 25 to 30 degrees Celsius, rainfall from 100 mm to 150 mm. So in that particular cluster, that will be called the niche of the particular species in which it is found. And there are two terms that are mostly used, the fundamental and the realized niche. So can you tell me what is the fundamental and what is the realized niche and how they are different from each other? How is what is the fundamental niche and what is the realized niche? Fundamental is pre-competitive and the realized is that is true. The fundamental niche is also called the pre-competitive niche, and the realized niche is also sometimes referred to as the post-competitive niche. Fundamental is the total environment where it lives. Okay, that is not actually correct. Fundamental niche is basically all the different or the potential niche, all the different sorts of habitats, resources, and the environment factors like temperature gradients and all these different things that that particular or species can live in or that particular species can inhabit. That will be called the fundamental niche. But the realized niche or the post competitive niche will always be smaller than the fundamental niche because that species will get kicked out from its fundamental niche by competition because other species are found there and they're better at utilizing those particular resources in that area. So in this diagram, you can see that the fundamental niches of these two species, one is green, one is purple, they are pretty large and they overlap for this significant area. And because of this overlap, I think the green species outcompetes the purple one, and that is why the realized niche of the purple species is this smaller, solid area. It is found only here, and the green species is found in this entire area. So, the realized niche technically cannot be bigger than the fundamental niche. It can only be less than or equal to the fundamental niche of the species. And moving on to a case study of barnacles. So, this was a classic study. It is always mentioned when you're talking about fundamental and realized niches. So, Connell, which who was in University of California, Santa Barbara, he basically was investigating these two different types of barnacles. One is the Thalamus stellus barnacle. The other one is the Balanus or the Balanoidus barnacle. So the thalamus is found in the upper parts of the what do you say? They are found in this coastal area and in the tidal zones. Basically, they're found in the tidal zones. This is what the thalamus barnacle looks like, and this is what the balanus looks like. So the thalamus is mostly found in the shallower water, and it is mostly exposed to air. It is found in the upper parts of the rocks where it is not submerged in water. And the other one, the balanus, was found in the lower area. It was rarely exposed to water, it exposed to the air. It was mostly submerged in water. And what Connell did in his time was very cunning. He basically took out one type of the barnacle and saw how the other one reacted. Did it expand to occupy the area, or did it just stay in its particular area? So when he removed the balanus, he saw that the thalamus occupies that entire area as well. So the thalamus has the capability, or it has the fundamental niche, which uh, which expands from the exposed as well as unexposed parts of the rock, the parts exposed to air as well as the parts submerged in water. But balanus, on the other hand, could not survive in the area that was exposed to air. So basically, its fundamental niche only stays in the areas that are submerged inside water. So you can see in this diagram here, the fundamental niche of the thalamus, which is shown in purple, extends from the upper to the lower parts, and the fundamental niche of the balanus is just in this part. And from this, you can also see that the balanus would be an aggressive species, because when it is present, it occupies its entire niche and it kicks out thalamus from that area. But if it is absent, only then can thalamus also come and occupy the submerged parts of the rock. Moving on to generalist and specialist species. So, as the term suggests, what do you think what do you think is a generalist species and what is a specialist species? Like, what do you think it means? Because, like, the term is very clear. It's generalist, wide variety of food and habitat. Yes. So, generalist species, as the term suggests, is pretty general in the way it lives. It can feed on a huge variety of food and can live in many different habitats. But a specialist species is specialized to some particular conditions, to some particular resources. So consequently, generalists, they tend to have broader niches, and they can adapt to many different types of habitats and many different types of resources and environmental conditions. Specialists, on the other hand, they will have a narrower niche than the generalists, and they can consume only certain particular resources. So in this image, they were trying to see that which birds they flourish in an urban habitat. So this is the area that a particular bird occupies, and uh, with which density in which it is found. So here you can see that the hooded robin, which is in this sort of a green, is a specialist species because it is found only in this particular area, in this particular zone. But the yellow-tailed black cockatoo, or the noisy fairy bird, or you can say even the even the squatter pigeon. These are some species that are more general. They have broader niches. They are found in more areas than these two, which is the robin and the moorhen. They are just so mostly you find generalists are um, very good at adapting to the human habitats as well. So you find crows every time, all the time you find them near human habitats. You find mynas, you find pigeons. These are generalist species. They can survive. And um, but other species that are specialized to forests and to certain resources, or to lower noise levels, lower light levels, they are called specialist species. So this is what we are showing in the niche width. Generalist species have broader niches. They occupy they can occupy many different sorts of areas, and the specialist species have narrower niches. So in this, it can either be based on the resources, based on the environmental factors, or based on the various, uh, say, landscapes in which that particular organism can be found. Moving on to how are these species associated with the community. So, I've taken this excerpt from this paper called Fidelity and Character Species, a critical evaluation. So, fidelity basically means faithfulness. So, Safar and Pawlowski, they basically distinguished species on five different levels of faithfulness to the community. So it can be an exclusive species, it can be a selective species, it can be a preferential species, indifferent or strange species. So out of these, as you would know, as their definitions suggest, the exclusive species or the selective and the preferential species, these three they call are sort of faithful, or they are true to their communities. But the indifferent or the alien species, they are infidel. They do not belong, they do not belong in that particular community. So as the definition of the accidental species says, that it is a rare species in a community. It is there either because it is an invasive species there, it just got introduced by some way, or it has been left behind by a previous community. So it is a rare species. It is by this paper's categorization, it is not really faithful to that particular community. Indifferent species, they don't have any affinity to any particular species, but they're not rare also. They're found in these species, but they're not really in these communities, sorry, but they're not really associated with those communities, which means that if the similar community is found somewhere else, this particular species might not recur. It might not reoccur in the other community as well. So that would be an indifferent species. A preferential species, a preferential species is one which is present in varying abundances in several different communities, but it is very abundant and very vigorously present in one particular community. So in that community, it will be very, very abundant in that area. Selective species, they are found mostly in certain particular communities, but they occasionally might be present in other communities as well. And exclusive species, in the last, they are confined to these particular communities, as the term suggests, and they will not be found outside these communities. They will just be found mostly in this with this set of species only. So, are you clear with these different definitions? Do you have any doubts? We can clarify. If it's clear, we can move on. Okay. Yeah. So, moving on to ecological succession, which was covered in the second lecture. So, what is ecological succession? What do you mean, or how do you define ecological succession? Can you guys tell me what is ecological succession? Gradual change of species in an area over time. Yes, you are correct. So, how Wikipedia defines it, or how we mostly define it, it's mostly that ecological succession is a process of change in which the species structure of a community, it changes over time, and it can either happen over decades if it's a primary succession, or it can happen over less amount of time if it's a secondary succession or cyclical succession. Okay, so it's basically means that it is a change in structure composition of species over a period of time. Yes, exactly. It is that. So here you have, say, four communities. You have community A, which is then uh, outcompeted, or it is succeeded by community B, and then community C, and in the last you have the stabilized community. So can you guys tell me what are these basically called? What will you call community A, and what will you call the stabilized community? Seer. Okay, seer is a term that is used for intermediate communities that fall between these two types of communities. The first one is mostly you would be aware it's the pioneer community, which comes in the first. And then the last stabilized community is called the climax. But the communities falling in between the pioneer species and the climax stages are called the serial stages. Okay, so moving on to what are pioneer species, as I already mentioned, pioneer species are basically the first species that reach that area, that reach the barren area, and they establish or they invade the barren area and then they establish in that area. They are hardy species. They can get established even in a disrupted ecosystem and even in very low nutritional uh, conditions, and it triggers ecological succession. So, can you guys tell me some of the characteristics that, uh, some of the things that characterize a pioneer species? What are the features of these species? Yes, they have the ability to grow on rocks, correct? To uh, to say it more generally, they have the ability to grow in very low nutrition. Yeah, in nutrient poor soil as well, and on nutrient poor water. And they grow quickly. Yes, so they can tolerate extremities. You're very correct. So some of the characteristics of pioneer species would be it can grow on barren rock in the nutrients poor soil, in nutrient poor water. It can tolerate extremities. It has very low nutrient requirements, which means it could mostly be a photoautotrough. Then it is a small in size, because then it would be easy to get dispersed from different areas and it would be easy to get established. It has a short lifespan, but it has a rapid growth, and it can disperse itself via, say, spores or by seeds, and it produces seeds in huge quantities. That is why they can go far and wide and they can reach these barren areas. And what is a climax community? So, as discussed, climax community is the one that is sort of the result of the ecological succession. So these communities, they are composed of plants, they have animals, they have fungi, or which would be the detritivores, and they are the result of the ecological succession in the area over time. And they're also called steady state communities because they do not undergo change that often or that easily after they have been established, after the climax community is established. And so there are four different types of climaxes that you observe in nature. So can you tell me which are these four different types of climax that we observe in nature? Climactic, edific, catastrophic, correct, and one more, disclimax. Very nice. So basically, the climactic climax is because of the climatic conditions of the area. It is governed by the climatic conditions of the area, the temperature, the precipitation, and such. Edific is governed by the soil, the features of the soil, the nutrition of the soil, the texture of the soil in that area. And catastrophic is because of the various catastrophes that can happen in the area. It could be flooded, could be droughts, could be volcanic activity, could be fire. So these determine the climax of that area. And this climax, that is because of either anthropogenic activities or because of activities of these various cattle or the the animals that we rear. So these are the different types of climaxes that we found in nature, and the characteristics of a climax community include that the vegetation of the climax community is tolerant to various environmental conditions of that particular area. There is a high species diversity because mostly a high species diversity is related to high stability. Though, as we learned in the lecture, that is not always the case. Food chains found in this particular community are complex, and even if some of the species get extinct, other ones can replace them, or they can take their place. Then they have a well formed spatial structure, they are very well stratified, for example, and there is an equilibrium present between the amount of nutrients that are being taken up by the community and the amount of nutrients that are being released. And the species compositions, they continue to remain the same over long periods of time. So this community, the climax community, is mostly, it will not undergo change for long amounts of time. So the species composition will also say the same, and they're good indicators of how the climate and other conditions are in the area. So if you observe a certain change in the species composition of these particular climax community, you can deduct or deduce that certain climatic conditions or certain other resource conditions in that area have been severely affected, and that is why those particular species cannot exist, or that is why the community has altered or changed in that particular area. So moving on to serial stages now. So as we discussed, serial stages are the intermediate stages that are found in succession in an ecosystem which is advancing towards the climax community. So between the pioneer and the climax community, you find these different serial stages, and they can consist of the different vegetation types that get adapted to the physical and the biotic conditions of that particular stage or that particular uh, stage of the ecological succession. So that what we call a local equilibria. So from the beginning, say from the lichens, you move on to the mosses. So the lichens in themselves, so they were the pioneer, okay, and the mosses is the next serial stage, which is there for some time because it is adapted to the physical and the biological conditions, to the local equilibria. And then not until the next species kicks in and outcompetes the mosses, they will stay there. So the different types of serial stages that are found in the ecological succession, as mentioned, are the hydrosphere, the halosphere, and the xerosphere. Hydrosphere basically is the serial stages in an area which has plenty of water. Halosphere is in saline water. Xerosphere is an area with minimal amount of water. And the three different types of xerospheres are the two different types of xerospheres are the lithosphere and the samosphere. Lithosphere is the one that is found on the barren rock, and samosphere is the one that's found on sand. It could be newly exposed coastal sand, or it could be the sand that gets exposed after glacial recession. So, this is primary succession. This is how primary succession works. So, you start off with bare rock. It could be because of geological upheaval, or it could be formed because of volcanic activity, and this would be then solidified magma. So, this is volcanic rock, and it gets infiltrated or invaded by lichens, which is the pioneer species here. So you can see these small dots. These are the lichens that they have shown. And moving on from lichens, say crustose lichens, you would move on to foliose lichen and then mosses in that area and other small plants. And then from there, you will reach to grasses and perennial plants, and then you'll have shrubs, and then you'll have the climax community, which is a proper forest, right? So, certain features of primary succession, or how you would define primary succession, would be that it begins in an area without any soil or with very low nutrient conditions. As I said, it could be because of glacial recession where the soil gets newly exposed, freshly exposed, or it could be on the sides of volcanoes where the magma gets solidified. Starts off with a pioneer species, which leads to the weathering of these rocks and further processes leading to decomposition, formation of soil in that area, which makes it suitable for successive communities to occupy the area. And it is slower than the secondary succession. Secondary succession, as discussed, does not start from a barren area. It does not start from volcanoes or volcanic rocks, but it happens in an area where there was already a community, a well established community, but it underwent destruction. In this example, there was a forest fire, the entire area underwent destruction, and there was a barren land. But there is still soil in this area. And so, here, the pioneer species will not does not need not be lichens. It can straight away be some small plants, moving on again to the perennials and then to shrubs and then to the forest, to the entire forest. And it is much shorter than the primary succession, which happens over hundreds of thousands of years. This can just happen in a few hundred years. And some of the characteristics of the secondary succession are, as I mentioned, does not begin on a barren land, begins with soil. The habitat got destroyed because of some reason. Could be forest fire, could be logging by humans, could be floods, could be a tornado, anything. Pioneer species does not occupy the barren rock, but it occupies the pre-existing soil, and therefore it is not lichens. It can be small plants, and it happens faster than primary succession. So, why does secondary succession happen faster than primary succession? What are the reasons behind this? Why is one of them faster and the other one slower? So, I have mentioned it while even while explaining both of them. So, you guys can tell me why one is fast and the other is takes a little longer, much longer actually. The soil is present, yes. So you don't start from a bare rock, and that is what takes a lot of time, is the breaking down of the rock in an area. So I can read out some of these various scenarios, and you can tell me which one of them is a primary succession and which is a secondary succession. So number one, an old house was torn down. Small plants and grasses grew in the vacant lot, and over the next few years, you could see bushes and tree seedlings beginning to grow in that area. So, what do you think is this an example of? Is it a primary succession or is it a secondary succession? Yes, this is an example of a secondary succession. Very nice. Next one, an undersea volcano erupted. It formed a small island. Mosses and lichens began to grow on the bare volcanic rock. One, two, primary. Uh, Rajeshri, are you saying that even the first scenario was a primary succession? So the first one is not primary succession because in this one there was an old house. So it basically means that there must have been a garden or there must have been some sort of a soil in that area, and this got torn out. And you can even notice here that in the vacant lot, then you had small plants and grasses. You did not have lichens or mosses as the pioneer species. So this would be a secondary succession. Is that okay? If you have a doubt, we can discuss. So the first example would be a secondary succession. Yes, Afia, you're correct. The second one is a primary succession. I just want to know, is the first one clear? Okay, moving on. Third one, logging company cut down all the large spruce trees in a forest. After the area was cleared, the seedlings began to sprout. Animals returned. It's a secondary succession. You're correct. Moving on to the fourth one, there was a wildfire across California. It continued to spread. Many plants and crops got destroyed. Animals were forced to find their new shelter. What will happen here? Secondary succession. Very nice. Last one, glacier retreats leaves behind gravel deposits called moraine. The youngest moraines are populated with bacteria and fungi and will soon become lichens. Primary succession. Very nice. So I guess you guys are clear with the concept of primary succession, secondary succession, pioneers and climax communities, even serial stages. Is it all clear? Yes. Very nice. So moving on, what are the mechanisms at action during an ecological succession? So, okay, so I have written 5 steps. Sorry. There are 7 different steps that were discussed in class for uh, ecological succession. Number one is nudation. That is basically a barren area getting exposed. So if it was volcanic eruption and magma got solidified, that is the formation of a new barren land. If a glacier retreated, that is the formation of a new barren land. Okay, so nudation is the formation of the barren land that is supposed to be occupied. Then there is migration and invasion of these pioneer species of the spores of lichens and things like that. And that is the second step. Third step is the establishment of these pioneer species. The lichens getting established in that area, they are getting aggregated in that area. There is more and more lichen on those rocks, and this is further leading to the decomposition of the rock. Then there is competition, as discussed. The next species will come in this area, so the lichen, it will give out some of these organic chemicals, which will lead to breaking down of the rock and addition of organic material, addition of soil to that area. Three, echesis. Echesis is basically the establishment of that particular stage, establishment of the pioneer species. So number two, it just means that the lichen spores reached the barren land. Okay, it is just the invasion. But number three, echesis means that these lichen spores, they got attached to the rock surface and then they got established in that area. Is the difference clear between these two things? Yeah. So in the number two, they're just invading the area, they're entering the area. Number three, they're establishing themselves in the area, they're aggregating. Then there is competition between different communities, and um, because of the lichens, as discussed, because of the addition of organic chemicals, because of the addition of dead matter, this leads to some soil, some nutrition, and the next species, this is called reaction, in which this the because in reaction to the lichens, the rock is breaking down and the soil is forming. And then the next community comes in, say mosses or say grasses. They will outcompete the lichens and then they will establish, and eventually you will reach the stabilization stage or the formation of the climax community. Is that okay? Okay. So moving on, talking about a very important thing is the stability of a community. So if you're even looking from the point of view of ecologists or if conservation scientists, if they are trying to conserve certain particular areas or certain particular communities, they need to look at how stable is the community. How much can it be disturbed? How much change can that community handle before it gets altered forever or before it gets destroyed? So mostly nature is very stable actually, and it can handle huge amounts of changes. And so we have three different types of stabilities that we'll be talking about. Number one is global stability, which means that it will always, a system, if it is perturbed, if it is fluctuated from its initial stage, it will always come back to the initial stage. Say this was the initial stage, this is a ball, and this is this two slopes on two sides. If you push the ball to one side or the other side, you can think of it yourself, it will always come back to the lowest point, right? Because the slope, it is always going to come back to the lowest point, however much you perturb it to either side. This system is said to be globally stable because it will always return back to the initial point. Next is local stability. In this, you have these various dips or you have these various low points which are locally stable. And so if you perturb the system a little here, if you perturb the ball to the right, it might not come back to this point and it might just topple over and reach this point here, where will be the next local stability. But overall, this might not be its globally stable point. There might be another point that is, so when you're talking about stability and in these graphs, the lowest point is said to be the most stable. And this locally stable, here you see that this would at least in the figure that you can see here, this would be the most stable point for the system to be at, because it is the one at the lowest point, right? But the system is even stable here locally because it might have just come from here and you say perturb it a little, it will still come back here. But only if it has enough push will it reach the global stability. Otherwise, it will get trapped in these little pockets of local inertia or local stability on its way to the global stability. Okay. And the last one is what I'm calling the irreversible state, which is not, it will never come back to the initial state. So if you perturb it enough, the community composition might change forever and it will not regain its initial composition, or the community might go to extinction. That those species do not live anymore. So say if you're talking about an endemic species of birds which are only found in certain places in the Western Ghats, say for example. So if humans were to destroy their entire habitat, you will not find, and these species is to get extinct from Western Ghats, then it's just gone. It is not present anywhere else in the entire globe, in the entire world. So that will be an irreversible change. So when conservation scientists or ecologists or other people, the government, when they're coming up with policies, they need to take into account how stable is the community that you're going to affect. So when you're say the government is coming up with a dam building project and they're trying to build up dams, and so there is this dam called the Sardar Sarovar Dam, which is built on the Narmada River. It is found in Gujarat. So when the government was coming up with this project, they just put forth what is, they put forth the good of the what good is the dam going to cause, and they did not account for all the ecological impacts, the environmental impacts that dam is going to have on the community there, on the area, on the forest. Because when you form a dam, you build a huge reservoir, and because of that reservoir, the water flow of the river, it gets impacted, and because of the standing water in the reservoir, a lot of the area of the forest gets submerged. So these are some things that need to be factored in when you are affecting community. So whenever humans are trying to cause a change, you should take into account how stable is the community, and how long, or even say for example when people are practicing zoom cultivation, they slash and burn cultivation, they cut down the entire forest, they cultivate that area, but then after reaping the crop from that area, they leave that area barren for some time to allow for the community to regenerate, for the forest to re-establish. So these are some things in which you need to keep in mind how the stability of that community is important, and if it will be able to come back from the from how much fluctuation you are exposing it to. Okay, so moving on to resistance versus resilience. So can you guys tell me what is resistance and what is resilience, and how do we measure them? How do you define a community resilience, and how do you define a community resistance? It is also again pretty clear from the terms themselves, but yes, can you please define both of these terms for me? No? So, uh, capacity to withstand hard condition is resistance. Yeah, that is there, but when we're talking about community stability, so this would be a normal definition of resistance in general. But when you're talking about community stability, how you would like to talk about resistance is that how much since we're talking about how much change can the community handle, the resistance will be how little does the community change in response to the external fluctuation. If you're perturbing the system, if you're fluctuating something in the system, how much and there is a variable of interest. Say there are 100 individuals of a particular bird species in an area. Okay, and they are all frugivores. And then what we are doing is we are cutting down forest trees. Now we want to see how is the variable of interest here, say, is the number of birds in that area. How is that variable of interest getting affected from that external perturbation, which is the cutting down of the trees? So if there were 1,000 trees and if cut down 200 and only 800 trees are left, still, say from 100 birds you are just at 90 birds or 95 birds, then you would say yes, the system is resilient for this much level of change. But say out of the 1,000 trees, if cut down 500 and only half of them are left, now you will see a major drop in the bird population also in that area. So you can say that okay, the community is only resistant for a little or this much amount of change, but after this, it is going to get severely impacted. So resistance is basically how little does the variable that you are interested in is changing from the external fluctuation. And how we measure it is by inertia. Inertia, as is explained in physics also, it is the capability of an object to resist change, or to stay in whichever state it is in and to not change. Resilience, on the other hand, is the tendency of the organism or the community to retain its structure, be it functional structure or be it the organizational structure after the external fluctuation. So there was a fluctuation, the community got changed, but it still has the resilience of coming back to the initial point. And we measure it by two things: elasticity and amplitude. Elasticity is the speed with which the perturbed system is going to recover back to the initial state. And the amplitude is how far can you perturb the system before it stops coming back to the initial stages at all. So, for example, like I was talking about the bird example, if you're cutting down half the forest, say, and now the birds are just 20 birds there. But if you let the forest rejuvenate, will the birds again regain their numbers? That is what we will refer to as, but that is what will be referred to by resilience. Okay. So is this clear? Is the difference between, okay, so resistance is basically that there is an external fluctuation, but the system is not changing. Okay. So like I talked about the birds and the trees. So you cut down 200 trees out of 1,000, but still the number of birds is still 100. It did not change at all, right? That will be the resistance of the community. The bird community is not altering in that area. Or say there were insects, there's everything like that. All of them are still present. And even if you cut down, say, 300 trees, there are 700 there to accommodate all these species, and they're still there. So the community has not changed, the community is not altered. So, which would mean it is resistant to change. But resilience, on the other hand, would be when you cut down, say, these trees, the community did get affected. The bird numbers came down from 100 to 50. But now you allow the community to re-establish, you allow the trees to regrow. Will the bird community or the insect community also re-establish in that area? That will be resilience. Is it clear? Okay. So resistance basically will mean that it will not change. It is unaffected by the external fluctuation. And resilience means it will change, but it will come back to its initial state. So so this is a paper called Post Disturbance Reorganization of Forest Ecosystems in a Changing World. So how are forest ecosystems getting reorganized after being disturbed? So they are talking about these four different factors. So say there is resilience. So after disturbing the forest, say there was a deforestation in that area. Humans carried out deforestation in the area. So what do you observe after the deforestation? You leave the land fallow and you allow it to regenerate. So what do you observe? If you observe that there is no change in the structure of the community from the community that was before deforestation, and there is no change in the composition, all the tree species that were found before deforestation have also regrown after deforestation. That would mean that this community is resilient, and there was resilience and it reestablished itself. Second thing is that there was no change in composition, okay, but the community has got restructured. So restructure here basically means that the structure of the community has changed now. Okay, say all the species have established again, they have re-established, but the number of organisms per species has changed. That is called restructuring of the community. Then change in composition, here the composition has changed but the structure has not changed. So the species only in that area have changed. You can notice from these clip arts. The species of trees in that area has changed, but their structure has not changed much. So like all of them say are more or less equally present. Even if their species are new, but their abundances are almost equal. That would be called the reassembly of that area. And replacement would be that this community got replaced, the structure got changed, the composition got changed. So you would say that the earlier community got entirely replaced by the new community. And the last but not the least would be the regime shift, which would be an irreversible change. Basically, here there was cyclical shifts happening between these different communities. But if you get out of this cycle, here a regime shift has happened. Here it happens only when the vegetation structure and the composition are altered to such an extent that the final trajectory leads it somewhere else. It is not the same forest anymore. It has now maybe it has become a scrubland, or maybe it has become a grassland. But it is not going to become this forest again. Is that okay? Is it clear? These are some ways in which a forest gets reorganized. And I would just like to highlight here again that when people are planning to, say, extract timber, to extract firewood from an area, they should keep in mind how much freedom we have to fluctuate or to perturb that system before it is going to just get destroyed. So, this was the last slide for today. And if you guys have any doubts from the slides, or from, say, from the quizzes, any of the quizzes, not the ones that were just given and the results are not out, but for any of the quizzes for which the solutions are out, we can discuss, or any doubts that you have in general. If not, you feel free to leave the meeting. But if anybody has any doubts, you can please ask me. Okay. Bye bye.